Her car was parked at O'Hare Airport, the doors locked, the engine cold, her luggage gone. But Maggie Brooks was nowhere to be found. She had threatened a man who defrauded her of tens of thousands through horse sales. Now he and his network had the most to gain if she stayed silent. Within days, investigators realized Maggie Brooks wasn't just missing. She'd vanished in a way only professional killers could manage, and her fortune remained untouched, leaving the world to wonder what really happened to her. Before she controlled millions, before anyone called her a philanthropist, before she vanished forever. Maggie Brooks was just a young woman checking coats at a Palm Beach country club, watching fortunes glide past without touching her. But now, Maggie Brooks drove away from her Oakwood Hills mansion on February 17th, with more money under her control than most cities would see in a year, a widow with no heirs living under her roof. She commanded a fortune now estimated between $4 and $5 million, wealth born from America's quiet obsession with penny candy and chocolate bars. That morning looked ordinary. It would be the last time anyone saw her alive. The Chicago Society knew Maggie Brooks well. Her name appeared regularly in the papers, tucked between photographs of crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes. At charity galas, she wrote six-figure checks as casually as others ordered dessert, her donations flowing through ballrooms where wealth circulated as freely as conversation. The Brooks fortune had been built by E.J. Brooks and Sons, a bulk candy empire that turned sugar and cocoa into something far more enduring. Even after the company's sale to American Home Products, the money never slowed. It multiplied quietly. Her Oakwood Hills estate sat in one of suburban Chicago's most exclusive enclaves, a place where privacy was bought and silence was expected. Winters never lasted long for Maggie. When the cold crept in, she retreated to her Florida residence, leaving Illinois behind until spring. Years earlier, she had formalized her generosity by endowing the Maggie Fifth Brooks Foundation with $2 million. Its mission focused on animal welfare. Those close to her said she trusted animals more than people. The way she spent her money suggested the same. Behind the estate's gates were private stables, housing her growing collection of show horses. Each animal cost more than most Americans would earn in decades. Their bloodlines were said to trace back to champions. Pedigrees discussed in hushed, reverent tones. Maggie spared no expense. To her, excellence was something you paid for in advance. Her calendar was filled with European buying trips. First-class flights carried her to Germany, Ireland, and Belgium, where she inspected horses alongside trainers who spoke with certainty and confidence. Every purchase was described as exceptional. Every investment was framed as safe. Back in Chicago, bank vaults guarded portfolios that generated more annual income than entire neighborhoods combined. Advisors grew wealthy managing her wealth, their livelihoods tied directly to her trust. The car leaving Oakwood Hills wasn't the mystery. What followed, what didn't happen afterward, would haunt Chicago for decades. Because when Maggie Brooks failed to arrive where she was expected next, the first people who noticed weren't the police. They were the ones closest to her money. Across Illinois, animal shelters knew Maggie Brooks as their guardian angel. Whenever a facility faced closure or expansion plans collapsed under rising costs, her checks arrived without fanfare. She never asked for recognition. The money appeared, solved the problem, and moved on. That February morning, she drove herself. Maggie preferred independence to chauffeurs, even when her wealth made caution fashionable. Her luxury car headed north, toward Duluth, Minnesota, and what was supposed to be a routine appointment at the Mayo Clinic. The drive should have ended there. It didn't. Instead, O'Hare Airport's parking lot would later reveal her abandoned vehicle, clean, undamaged, parked as if she intended to return shortly. Maggie herself had vanished, dissolving into thin air like mist over Lake Michigan. No body surfaced, no witnesses stepped forward, no explanation followed, just an empty car and a fortune suddenly without an owner. as if wealth itself could disappear. The Candy fortune, now estimated in 9 figures, became Chicago's most expensive missing person. Maggie Brooks's life was reduced to police reports, financial ledgers, and a growing sense of dread that no amount of money could resolve what had gone wrong. Friends later told investigators that Maggie hadn't been at ease before she disappeared. She'd been planning something. Her mood shifted between determination and quiet fear, sometimes within the same conversation. In show-jumping circles, whispers grew louder, rumors of fraud, of horses valued at thousands sold for hundreds, of deals that didn't add up. Maggie, they said, had begun to realize she was being deceived. The question wasn't whether Maggie Brooks had discovered something. It was how close she'd come to acting on it before she vanished. And buried inside her financial records was one transaction so irregular that investigators would later describe it as the moment Maggie Brooks stopped being a benefactor and became a liability. Charles Reynolds's name began surfacing again and again. He was the charming horse dealer, the one who'd sold her the animals, the one who'd earned her confidence slowly, carefully, and some believed gained far more than trust. Around the same time his name rose to prominence, the Mayo Clinic confirmed something quietly unsettling. Maggie Brooks never arrived for her appointment. Staff noted the absence without urgency. Wealthy patients missed checkups all the time. Appointments were rescheduled. Lives continued. Maggie Brooks never rescheduled anything again. As days stretched into weeks, her disappearance hardened into an investigation, one that would eventually drag murder, financial fraud, and organized crime connections into the light. What initially looked like a missing wealthy widow began to resemble something far darker. But Maggie's story didn't begin in Oakwood Hills, or Europe or Florida. It began decades earlier, far from money, on an Ohio farm where no one could have imagined a woman would someday vanish while controlling millions. Millfield, Ohio welcomed Maggie Marie Voorhees on November 1, 1911. She was born into farm life, where wealth meant owning the land beneath your boots, rather than answering to someone else's ledger. The future available to women there was narrow. Narrower still for women whose marriages failed. Divorce carried a quiet stigma, one that followed you long after papers were signed. Palm Beach, Florida offered something different. Reinvention. Seasonal wealth flooded south every winter, and the service economy expanded to meet it. Maggie found work at the Indian Creek Country Club, checking coats for millionaires who tipped generously and spoke casually about sums she'd never seen. From just a few feet away, she watched how extreme wealth behaved, how it moved, who it trusted, and where it was careless. Years later, investigators would wonder whether Maggie learned too well from those early lessons, because she understood wealth's blind spots long before she ever owned any. Palm Beach didn't just change Maggie's circumstances, it reshaped her instincts. And one man she met during those years would later reappear at the center of her fortune, long before Charles Reynolds ever entered her life. Thomas Brooks noticed the woman handling his overcoat. She was 31, he was 71, but to the aging Candy heir, Maggie was more than a service worker moving through the margins of his world. He saw composure, intelligence, someone who understood how to observe without being seen. Thomas's fortune traced back to Ernst Jude Brooks, a German immigrant who had risked $1,000 in 1906 and built something enormous from it. E.J. Brooks and Sons transformed sugar into empire, flooding America with caramels, chocolate drops, and peppermints. Chicago factories ran constantly, turning mass production into generational wealth. Their marriage in 1950 altered Maggie's life overnight. The wage earner became a millionaire's wife, a union that crossed class lines only money could erase. With the ring came access, homes, accounts, and expectations that no one explained but everyone enforced. Oakwood Hills, Illinois became their primary residence, close enough to Chicago for business, distant enough to offer privacy and calm that suited Thomas's age. The estate was designed for quiet permanence, not spectacle. Florida remained their winter refuge. It preserved the place where their lives had first intersected, while sparing them the cruelty of Midwestern winters. Seasons passed between the two homes with ritual precision. Maggie learned wealth slowly. Charity boards required attendance, not just checks. Social calendars dictated appearances. Causes needed patronage, but from the right families, in the right rooms. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing the rules that governed people who never feared money. The woman who once checked coats was now studying the machinery of influence, knowledge that would later shape how she protected her fortune and who she chose to trust with it. Thomas Brooks gave Maggie access to wealth. What he also gave her was time inside its inner workings. And as Thomas's health declined, the question of who would guide that fortune next began to quietly rearrange loyalties around them. The routine held for years, until Thomas's death transferred control between $2 and $4 million directly into Maggie's hands. There was no gradual transition, no apprenticeship. One day she was protected by proximity to wealth. The next, she was responsible for it. The change was absolute. Yesterday's coat check girl now controlled a fortune worth more than $50 million in modern purchasing power. Chicago's charitable world took notice immediately. Animal welfare organizations, in particular, found in Maggie a donor who didn't just fund causes. She believed in them. Her concern for vulnerable creatures wasn't performative. It was personal. She formalized that commitment by establishing the Maggie Fifth Brooks Foundation, aimed squarely at preventing animal cruelty. The initial $2 million endowment was serious money. Grants began moving quickly to shelters and rescue operations across the region, stabilizing institutions that had survived year to year on hope. Years earlier, American Home Products had purchased the Brooks Candy Company for $56 million, a figure that would exceed $1 billion today. The sale severed Maggie from daily business operations while preserving the wealth itself. Her money now lived in diversified investments, generating returns without requiring expertise she had never needed to develop. Financial advisors stepped in to manage the machinery. Their fees were negligible compared to the portfolios they oversaw. Their guidance was considered essential. On paper, the system was secure, yet this same structure that protected her assets from mismanagement created vulnerabilities. The same trust Maggie extended to protect animals would soon shape how she relied on the people managing her fortune. Wealth no longer demanded her labor, but it demanded her faith in others, and that faith, quietly and invisibly, was already being tested. Maggie understood charity better than finance. Trust came more naturally to her than verification. By 1973, she entered Chicago's equestrian world. A place where horses cost fortunes and expertise meant knowing the difference between pedigree and performance, truth and salesmanship. Charles Reynolds would teach her exactly how expensive ignorance could become when combined with wealth and misplaced confidence. By the 1970s, Reynolds had refined his approach. He moved deliberately through Chicago's show-jumping circuits, identifying wealthy widows with unsettling accuracy. The profiles repeated: substantial inherited money, limited technical knowledge of horses, social ambitions that equestrian circles seemed to promise, and a loneliness that made connection feel like safety. His method wasn't rushed. Months were spent building rapport. Conversations turned personal. Romantic undertones blurred professional boundaries. Trust was cultivated until large financial decisions felt natural, almost inevitable. The math of the con was simple. Horses purchased for $5,000 to $10,000 were resold to victims for $80,000 to $100,000. The difference disappeared into layers of intermediaries and reassurances. When Maggie Brooks entered this world, everything appeared legitimate. In 1975, she purchased 3 horses for $98,000. The sale was fronted by Charles's brother, Samuel Reynolds. Charles remained just out of sight, directing the arrangement from behind the scenes. Later appraisals would value the 3 horses at less than $20,000 combined. a markup exceeding 500%. The European buying trips Maggie once believed represented refinement and care were beginning to reveal themselves as rehearsed illusions. This wasn't a single bad deal, it was a system. This individual fraud connected to something darker, and investigators would soon realize that Reynolds's operation wasn't isolated. It was part of something far larger, a network they would eventually label the Midwest's horse mafia. Most people will scroll away and forget this ever happened, but not you. You have stayed, so please subscribe because some mind-blowing stories are coming your way. Also, kindly write in the comment where you are watching from and the time. Let's go on. The fraud went far beyond inflated prices. Horses weren't just being sold dishonestly, they were being killed for insurance money, electrocution, poisoning, starvation, barn fires staged to look accidental, flame-swallowing animals locked inside. Each death triggered a payout. Each payout required silence. Between the mid-1970s and mid-1980s, an estimated 500 to 600 horses died this way. The scale alone demanded coordination. Veterinarians issued false health certificates. Insurance agents inflated valuations. Trainers coached owners on how to lie convincingly. Paperwork moved smoothly while barns burned. Federal investigators would later map the network's reach. Co-conspirators stretched from suburban Chicago to Kentucky's most prestigious breeding farms. Charles Reynolds occupied more than one role inside the operation. He sold overpriced horses to wealthy victims, and then participated in the insurance schemes that transformed living animals into cash. By early 1977, Maggie Brooks understood what had happened to her. The realization didn't come all at once. It built slowly, deal by deal, appraisal by appraisal, until anger replaced denial. She had been deceived, not casually, systematically. Court records later showed Maggie had begun threatening exposure. She intended to go to authorities, not just about the fraudulent sales, but about the insurance killings. Her planned testimony would have revealed both fraudulent sales and insurance horse murders, potentially sending the entire network to federal prison. The trust Maggie once placed in trainers, advisors, and buyers had inverted, becoming the very weapon that now made her dangerous. This was no longer about lost money, it was about survival, because Maggie Brooks now possessed knowledge capable of destroying operations worth millions, and the freedom of everyone involved depended on her silence. Federal prosecutors would later reach a blunt conclusion. Maggie Brooks's murder was commissioned to stop her from testifying. The motive wasn't speculation, it was prevention. Behind the polished veneer of the show-jumping world sat a structure of routine criminality. Horses were assets. Death was a revenue stream. Wealthy women were selected not for companionship, but for access. Charles Reynolds had survived in this ecosystem for years. Maggie Brooks was different. She had money that granted credibility and anger that fueled resolve. The candy fortune had wandered into organized crime's most efficient niche. In that world, witnesses weren't confronted. They were removed. Silence wasn't requested. It was enforced. By February 1977, more than one person had reason to ensure Maggie Brooks never reached a courtroom. Her knowledge tied fraudulent sales to insurance murders, exposing profits measured in millions and crimes spanning states. To those involved, her continued existence represented risk. Eliminating that risk was a calculation. The trust Maggie had once extended freely to trainers, advisors, and buyers had transformed her into a liability the moment she withdrew it. On the morning of February 17th, Maggie Brooks ate breakfast in her Oakwood Hills kitchen. She reviewed her schedule. The Mayo Clinic appointment sat exactly where it always had. There was nothing unusual about the day. Staff watched her leave alone. She drove north toward Duluth, Minnesota, a 350-mile trip she'd taken before for routine care. She would never arrive. Somewhere between suburban Chicago and her destination, Maggie Brooks stopped existing. vanishing so completely it was as if the road itself had swallowed. Her luxury car appeared days later at O'Hare Airport, abandoned in a parking structure. No explanation, no luggage, no indication she had ever planned a journey. The vehicle alone became a silent monument to her disappearance. Security cameras in 1977 were primitive. They recorded little, captured less. There was no footage of who had parked the car, or when it had arrived. Surveillance offered nothing but blank frames. Police first considered voluntary disappearance. Wealthy people sometimes fled, reinventing themselves under new identities with hidden funds. But Maggie's financial activity told a different story. No unusual withdrawals, no liquidations, no evidence of preparation. Nothing suggested she had planned to vanish. Attention quickly turned to Charles Reynolds. Investigators learned of Maggie's threats to expose his horse fraud operations. She had given him an ultimatum: return her money or face criminal charges. That demand risked everything he had built, not just the fraud, but the wider network involved in insurance murders and horse thefts. Federal agents developed a grim timeline. February 17th, or immediately afterward, was likely the date of her murder. Professional expertise was required. Maggie disappeared without witnesses, without forensic traces, without any evidence of violence, vanishing as completely as the horses she had once purchased. The very people she had trusted to manage wealth, to guide her through equestrian circles, were now central to the forces ensuring her silence. But wealth alone didn't protect her. It made her a target. Prosecutors later suspected the Chicago outfit, organized crime experts in making people disappear, their decades of experience providing the cold efficiency that left Maggie Brooks untraceable. Investigators narrowed Maggie Brooks's possible disposal to two chilling methods: industrial chemical vats capable of dissolving organic matter entirely, or blast furnaces reaching temperatures sufficient to vaporize any trace. Silver Creek Equestrian Center drew scrutiny. At the Hawthorne Stables facility, new concrete foundations had been poured just as Maggie disappeared. Retired journalist Robert Crane and documentary producer Stephen Halleck independently concluded the site represented the most plausible burial location. Limited excavations occurred over the years, but authorities refused comprehensive searches without precise burial information. The facility continued operations until December 2016, when demolition crews reduced the structures to rubble, exposing soil that had lain untouched for decades. Calls for systematic forensic excavation were ignored. Officials insisted searching blindly would be futile. Complicating matters, Carl Whitman, Maggie's houseman, had forged checks after her disappearance. At first, his theft hinted at potential involvement, but investigations revealed opportunism rather than premeditated criminality. He had taken advantage of Maggie's absence, not orchestrated it. 4 decades passed. No confirmed sightings, no credible leads, no physical evidence of her fate. The absence of remains made prosecuting her murder impossible. Investigators were forced to pursue justice through creative legal strategies, relying on circumstantial evidence, testimony, and the meticulous reconstruction of crimes that spanned states and decades. 19 years passed between Maggie Brooks's disappearance and Charles Reynolds's arrest. Prosecutors faced the fundamental challenge of prosecuting a murder with no body. They sidestepped the obstacle by targeting racketeering, constructing a case around the decades of horse fraud Maggie had threatened to expose. The 1994 indictment named Reynolds among 23 defendants, detailing mail fraud, wire fraud, and systematic horse killings. Reynolds avoided trial on murder charges by pleading guilty to 15 counts of fraud, but his sentencing hearing became an unofficial murder trial. Judge Milton Hart presided, weighing evidence under the preponderance standard required for sentencing enhancement. Shadur concluded that Reynolds had been deeply involved in Maggie Brooks's death, enough to justify the maximum sentence despite the absence of a formal murder conviction. 30 years in prison effectively became a life sentence for the 65-year-old, served at Coleman Federal Correctional Complex. Prison turned Reynolds into his own advocate. Appeals followed appeals. He repeatedly claimed innocence regarding Maggie's murder, even while acknowledging his role in the horse fraud schemes. In 2005, a motion restated his claims, separating financial guilt from the death itself. Judge Shatter rejected the attempt as untimely. The evidence, he ruled, justified treating Reynolds as Maggie's killer. Even without a body, even without murder charges, the trail of deceit, greed, and calculated murder had finally reached a reckoning. But after nearly 4 decades, Maggie Brooks herself remained absent, her ultimate fate buried in mystery, as complete and unsolved as the icy roads she drove on that February morning. Presidential clemency never came. Reynolds remained imprisoned, though after 24 years he earned transfer to a halfway house in 2019. Death finally claimed him in August 2022, aged 89. Any hope of a deathbed confession or a revelation about Maggie Brooks's fate died with him. Investigators were left with conclusions drawn from decades of evidence. The Chicago outfit had likely handled her body disposal, chemical vats or blast furnaces, techniques perfected over decades, explained why 40 years of searching had produced nothing. Maggie's fortune, carefully structured and protected, never fell into the hands of killers. Instead, it flowed into her foundation, growing from millions to 9 figures. By the 2020s, the Maggie Fifth Brooks Foundation controlled roughly $200 million, distributing nearly $10 million annually. Over 90% of that went directly to charitable grants, primarily supporting animal welfare, the causes Maggie had championed in life. Her legacy, both alive and absent, endured in the institutions she had protected. The wealth she once commanded, the very thing that made her a target, had become a shield for the causes she loved. Though Maggie Brooks herself never returned, her influence persisted in every rescue, every grant, every shelter that survived because of her foresight. Yet the ultimate question remained unanswered. Where and how did Maggie Brooks truly vanish that February morning? Secondary funding extended beyond animal welfare, supporting child welfare and education, giving the foundation a reach far greater than Maggie could have achieved personally. Investigators noted the bitter irony. Murder meant to seize wealth, instead ensured that wealth would serve charitable purposes forever. Reynolds gained nothing. His co-conspirators gained nothing. Maggie's vision, however, flourished through the foundation that bore her name. In December 2016, Silver Creek Equestrian Center was demolished, extinguishing the last realistic hope of finding remains that some believed lay beneath its foundations. Authorities continue to classify the case as open, yet the chances of solving Maggie Brooks's disappearance diminish with each passing year. The coat-check girl who married into millions became evidence that even a 9-figure fortune could not buy safety from those willing to kill for profit. Maggie Brooks vanished while pursuing justice for fraud, and in doing so, became Chicago's most enduring mystery and its most successful charitable legacy. The fortune that once made her a target now preserves her influence. Decades after she vanished, her disappearance remains unsolved, her legacy alive, and the story of her life, a cautionary tale of wealth, trust, and betrayal. Where Maggie Brooks went that February morning, and what truly became of her, remains a question that may never be answered.